Hi, I'm Max Bergman.
And I'm Donatien Rui.
And this is The Eurofile, a podcast where we look at Europe through a Washington lens. Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Eurofile. Following a very eventful holiday break, we're back to discuss several major developments that are already set to shape the transatlantic agenda for Europe and Washington heading into the new year. Today, we're going to discuss a flurry of activity in Europe and in transatlantic relations, including the outcome of the European Council Summit, the status of the Mercosur trade agreement, what's happening with the funding of Ukraine, and we'll discuss the intensifying transatlantic clashes over tech, which emerged right before Christmas with the sanctioning of Thierry Breton and other officials. And finally, we're going to talk about Greenland in the wake of the U.S. operation in Venezuela, which has now led a number of U.S. officials to talk about how Greenland is next, raising the alarm in Denmark and in many other European capitals, and also raising the alarm in Greenland. So we'll talk about that and what 2026 holds for the transatlantic relationship. Let's start with the European Council Summit. And this happened what feels like a year ago. There are two big things on the table. One was Mercosur, and maybe we'll start there, and then we'll go to the Ukraine and the reparations loan. So Mercosur, what happened is that Italy decided to sort of be a little bit the skunk at the party and held out. They didn't kill Mercosur, but it's been delayed into January, and we expect next week or the week after for the deal to finally be signed. But they sort of were holding out for sort of a last little bit of compensation from the Commission in the kind of horse trading, backroom deal making that tends to happen in European politics. So Mercosur didn't die. And that was the big fear, I think, when we previewed the summit. But it's still alive, and it looks like it's on track to happen.
Yeah, it looks like it's on track. It seems like there are concessions being given, some maybe more money for farmers, although that is an interesting dynamic because there are conversations for the next EU budget about reductions in the common agricultural policy. But it seems like Brussels would be able to shove some money towards farmers. It's important, I think, to remind all our listeners that the reason why it matters that Italy, quote unquote, changed its mind before the summit is that it makes it a decisive vote. France, Poland, others were still opposed to it, but without Italy, they didn't have enough weight in the voting mechanism to block the voting, the yes vote, basically. But with Italy, they did. So it meant that it got delayed probably to mid-January, as you mentioned. It is ultimately a meaningful agreement, not just because it's been negotiated for 25 years, as we've mentioned before, but because this is Europe's attempt to counterbalance the U.S. attitude and policies towards trade and really try to maintain open trade alive.
And develop positive ties with South America, which, might be sort of important now.
It's just a strange dynamic these days. So it's definitely not dead, as you said. Part of the negative reactions to this vote was just that people were expecting it to finally be closed by the end of the year and not move over to another year. But we'll be looking at this for the next few weeks.
Yeah, I think what we have to understand here is that this is sort of normal European politics, that Europe has a politics. I think European summits are oftentimes viewed as foreign policy events, like traditional, like a G7 style summit where all the leaders are coming and everything's sort of already agreed. And then there's like a photo op and everyone signs. But no, this is legislative. The smoke is in the room. The pizzas are being ordered. This is like
pizza. Have you seen their menu? It's much nicer than that.
They have nicer menus. On Capitol Hill, you have to look at like the pizza places,
deliveries.
Pizza deliveries. But this is about extraction, right? This is about getting something for your constituents, just like senators do, members of Congress in negotiations on the Hill. And so Meloni is like, all right, I can maybe get a little bit more for Italian farmers. That will be helpful to me politically. I can do that. And so, and they're playing chicken here. They're, threatening to cancel everything. And so it always looks like it's on the cusp of collapsing, and then somehow it isn't. And so it's annoying that I think there wasn't a big signing ceremony before Christmas, but Lula ultimately had, I guess, talked to Meloni, the president of Brazil, and it's all fine, or, was willing to delay it a couple of weeks.
He understands that those are not existential dynamics for the deal. And he also understands this is going to be very important for Brazil especially given everything that's happening with the US.
The long-term implication for the EU is really the EU budget, which is being negotiated. We've talked about on this podcast about the EU budget, how it's done in 7 years. And so they're setting the kind of amounts that are there, and they're always hoping to reduce the common agricultural policy. And this is like the pushback against that. And so the implications here, the negative implications, I think you would say, is that there's now probably less money for other things that you could argue are probably more important for Europe, European strategic autonomy, or whatever it may be. But overall, okay. Like, I think that was a really positive outcome. Mercosur did not die. It's almost, 98% going to happen. I mean, maybe in 98 is too high, but it's on the cusp of being signed. Okay, so the next thing is the reparations loan. And this is where your country, Belgium, were the big meanies at the European Council Summit. Belgium effectively said no. To remind the listeners, what was on the table is Euroclear, where the Russian assets have been frozen. And the EU was going to not seize them, but was going to basically de facto seize them by issuing a loan tied to them. And so it would be effectively taking Russia's money and giving it to Ukraine. This was trumpeted on both sides of the Atlantic as a really big step, and they couldn't get there. Why couldn't they get there? I think there's some debate about this, but it seemed like Belgium was nervous about being on the hook. If, let's say, you have a new Russian government in 15 years or 10 years, and they sue to get their money back and they win, then suddenly Belgium, a small country, is on the hook for like 150 billion euros. And so they wanted guarantees. The guarantees never quite sufficed. There's also some rumors that there was some tax revenue that was going to the Belgian coffers. And so Belgium took a hard line here. They didn't compromise as everyone sort of expected. And then the end result sort of slipped in was, okay, fine, we'll just do Eurobonds. We'll just go and borrow 90 billion, just give it to Ukraine and make Ukraine solvent. And so the reaction to the summit was like, oh, this is a huge failure. They didn't seize the frozen Russian assets. And as someone who
always says, just do Eurobonds,
has been saying this again and again and again, to just see Eurobonds like slipped in some ways it was brilliant politically. Because what happened here, it's Merz, and all the Scandinavians are like, oh, we're never going to borrow again. The EU can never borrow. Had done reparations loan. And then this was sort of slipped in as sort of this default, and no one treated it as a big deal. But this is like a really big deal in my book.
Yeah, there's so many dynamics at play here. I think the point you made earlier as it related to Mercosur also applies to this around people expect these summits to be big foreign policy events, which obviously when it relates to Ukraine is a big foreign policy and defense dynamic, but is often a domestically related dynamic. And for Belgium, that was also the case. Bart de Wever, the prime minister, just didn't want Belgium to be on the hook for all this money. And I think what played a big role here is that, to be honest, there are several member states who didn't want to agree to unconditional backing of Belgium in case those loans, there was a problem with Euroclear, things were recalled, whatever. They just didn't want to agree to that. And that was a framework that, Bart de Wever was conveniently the figure of this pushback, but other member states probably agreed. I think the picture that's emerging here is that the Commission and Merz tried to make frozen assets look like the only option from September onward. And they didn't plan very well for another option by the time the summit came around, which is why it feels like this joint loan kind of came out of nowhere.
I disagree here, actually. I think this was done beautifully from a political standpoint.
By whom?
By Merz, by everybody. Because if you had made it, well, you have two options. One, we could do reparations loan. Or there's a second option of we do this thing that we said we would never do, which is borrow again, because the next gen EU, which is when the EU borrowed funding during COVID, was supposed to be a one-off, quote unquote, I'm doing air quotes, but the Germans kept on saying, this is never going to happen again. This is a one-off. And so if Merz had gone, well, we have two options and we're trying to figure out which one, I think everyone would have said, oh, well, you're betraying the word of Germany that, this was supposed to be one-off. And not just Germany, it's all the Scandinavians as well. It was at 4 a.m. Everyone was super tired. Like I was up because I was in America, right? So I was watching the press conference here. It's like all the journalists are dead tired. And they're just like, oh yeah, we figured out a way and we're doing this thing. And everyone's like, they didn't do reparations loan, tisk tisk. But they slipped it in. And why this matters, let me just say, this is huge for Ukraine, for everything. Because what they have done is now set a precedent of how they can just borrow money. The EU can just borrow money.
Including when some member states don't want to participate, which is important. Like Hungary didn't want to do this and they went around it.
Because everyone thought they had to have 27 all unanimously agreeing, and they figured out a way to do it with 24. So they figured out now how to borrow money. The second thing they did is they actually froze the frozen Russian assets. Before, what happened is every 6 months, they had to have a unanimous vote to keep sanctions in place, which meant every 6 months they had to vote or to keep the assets frozen. That meant Hungary, every 6 months, there was like this, oh crap, like moment where maybe the Hungarians or someone would take a hostage. And what they did using sort of an emergency procedure said, no, we're going to switch how we do this and make it qualified majority voting to unfreeze. So now to unfreeze the assets requires a majority of the European Union states to vote to unfreeze it. And that's not going to happen anytime soon. So they can always go back and just take the money from the frozen assets whenever they want. So this to me was like the optimal scenario for Ukraine and for Europe, because it creates a clear line where Europe can now raise money for what it needs to do, Eurobonds, which could be used for anything. And you still have this huge pile of money just sitting there that they can access whenever they want.
Yeah, the money based on Eurobonds is not unlimited, though, because it is based on the budget headroom, which will obviously be caught in the discussions. But I agree with you on the whole. I think this kind of felt like a pretty classic end of year council to me, which is everyone's like, oh my God, there's so much on a to-do list going into it. Will they? Won't they? Oh, we don't know. They're tense discussions. It goes late in the night. Everyone's like tired. Side meeting, back in the room. And then something comes out and everybody wants to go off for the break anyway. And that's kind of it. I will say, I think we disagree a little bit on how much strategery.
I'm not saying this was strategery. I think they defaulted into what was a very politically convenient way, because they now are doing Eurobonds without any political fuss about it.
Sure. I don't know. I just don't know that Merz particularly planned for this. I think that's just a situation he ended up with and it works for him, but that was not his preferred outcome. The picture remains for me a little bit of an EU leadership that wants to do a lot on the global stage, but lacks the tools and sometimes the energy or the political weight to push this forward. And that's going to be, I think, a big dynamic for 2026.
One of the things that I find super frustrating about all analysis about Europe is that Europe is always collapsing. Europe is always failing. Europe is always not getting its act together, quote unquote, whatever the hell that means. And my God, they did this amazing thing. They figured out a way forward. It may not be exactly how it was planned out, but
or the amount.
Or the amount, and it gets there at the end, but Europe acts, and then no one pays any attention to when Europe acts. And instead, all the coverage at the end of the summit, there's always this teeth gnashing. I understand why, because those that are advocating Europe to do more need to make everything seem like a crisis. And oftentimes it is that Europe needs to do more, and oh my God, it needs to act, So you have to create the sense of crisis. And then those that don't really want Europe to act have no interest in saying all the good things that Europe is actually doing. So no one is actually out there being like, actually, Europe's okay. Actually, things are fine. Actually, it's getting stuff done. It's stepped up in 2025 to back Ukraine, and it looks like it's going to be able to continue to do that into 2026. So to me, the big thing about this summit is that Europe's okay. The Mercosur is going to happen, the reparations loan. And so I think there needs to be a little bit of a shift in mindset about how people think about and talk about Europe. 2026, year of crisis. There's far-right parties emerging. The center is collapsing in UK, Germany, France. Yes, all of that has a degree of truth, but everyone's been saying this sort of stuff for like 20 years. And the EU has gotten bigger. It has more powers and is more trusted across Europe than it ever has been before. So like, it's not collapsing, folks.
Sure. I want us to move to the tech stuff. I think that also is a commentary on the state of EU level media and the fact that saying, oh, things are actually kind of fine. It just doesn't work the same. Trust me, Belgian newspapers were like, this is great. Yeah. So it depends where you look.
But so let's get to the tech clash that happened right before Christmas.
Speaking of things the EU is going to have to do in 2026. In brief, early December, because I think it's important to mention that, the Commission fines X or Twitter for breach of the Digital Services Act or DSA for online content moderation, etc. A couple of weeks later, the United States government puts visa bans on several Europeans, French, German, and British, the highest level one being Thierry Breton, who is the former commissioner who worked a lot on the Digital Services Act, for things that he did as part of his official functions. He is no longer an EU official, to be clear, but he is no longer allowed to come to the United States for things related to digital censorship. The other people involved in those visa bans are people who work on countering disinformation and online hate. And that has been deemed by the US government as this digital censorship and an affront to freedom of speech. So that's kind of what happened. Pretty remarkable.
And we should note that Thierry Breton has been to CSIS. I hosted him for a fireside chat here a few years ago, and he was essentially the number 2 person in the European Commission. So a very senior figure, a real shot across the bow. Sarah Rogers, the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, who's become quite a lightning rod in transatlantic relations, described him as, quote unquote, the mastermind of the Digital Services Act.
That's where words are funny, because you can call him the mastermind and it sounds really ominous, or you can just say he was the architect of the DSA, which is just what you do when you push such a big piece of legislation.
Yeah. So, that led to a huge Twitter back and forth between the whole irony is this was all happening on X or Twitter. U.S. officials, the U.S. ambassador to the European Union, Marco Rubio, the Deputy Secretary of State again, Sarah Rogers, all tweeting about how horrible the EU is, how the EU is collapsing. This led to responses from EU officials. But I think what it does is basically set the stage for a huge coming collision now over tech policy. You have the political appointees now in place within the State Department and other places. I think legitimately think of this issue in very personal terms. Their president was kicked off Twitter after, January 6th, 2021. They look at all the banning that took place of the far right, after that riot or coup against the United States and other things, and think that's bad. They're also pushing back against the quote unquote censorship of the far right, i.e. a lot of neo-Nazis stuff online. They feel this very strongly. I think they feel like they have the runway to now push this. So it strikes me that this is only going to escalate and become a much bigger deal in 2026. I thought this would be a much bigger deal in 2025. It took a long time to get there. But I think when we look ahead, the EU is going to have to do certain things. Right now, X is getting criticized because Grok, its AI tool, is basically violating all sorts of rules, norms, laws about child pornography and all sorts of other things. So EU has a law that's you can't do these sort of things. So it's either going to be enforced or not. And if it's enforced, there's going to be a clash.
Yeah. And just anecdotally, on the news in Belgium, several times there were segments about AI or image alteration being used, especially against young women, for example, and how violating that is of your own privacy, et cetera. So it's not an issue that's dying by any means. There's 2 aspects at play here. One is the ideological one that you mentioned, both on the US side of people in the administration feeling very strongly that this is, an attack against freedom of speech and their president, et cetera. But also on the European side, for decades, there's been a slightly different interpretation of freedom of speech for very understandable reasons and legal dynamics as well involved in how we define freedom of speech. But it goes beyond that. There's also a different European approach to what it's like to regulate content online. EU officials describing it in this way, which is what's illegal offline should be illegal online as well. So there's the ideological component here. There's also the economic and regulatory component. And the U.S. administration clearly has decided to, in a way, carry water for the tech companies in Europe, even though these European regulations are not designed specifically for U.S. companies. It just so happens that tech companies, most of them are U.S. based, but we're looking at a U.S. administration here that is attacking legitimately passed regulation and laws. And what's ironic here is that the national security strategy, which we've discussed on this podcast, talks about an undemocratic Europe, but close to 90% of the European Parliament voted for this law and all the member states approved it. So it sounds pretty democratic to me.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest irony of this, especially when we focus our ire on Germany and Germany doesn't fully protect freedom of speech because in its constitution and its basic law, it has curtailed freedom of speech. Well, when did they write that? Oh, yeah. Who was the occupying power that was helped
I think
oversee?
we kind of helped
writing
them
of it?
write it.
I'm sure if at the time we were like, you know what, we really need to have Nazis have freedom of speech. We were like, we need to put that in there. But no, this was about how this could never happen again in Germany. And so that's what their constitution is structured to facilitate. And that includes some curtailment of freedom of speech, which also exists in the United States. Fire in a crowded theater is something you're not supposed to do, incitement, all other things like that. So there are differences, but I think where this comes down is Europe will just have to make a decision about whether it's going to enforce its laws or not. I should note that Thierry Breton has been banned from coming into the country. This was not sort of the full power of U.S. sanctions, which have been directed against officials from the International Criminal Court, which means that like you can't use a credit card because it relies on the U.S. banking system. So they haven't gone as far as they could. So I think they think, oh, they're doing a sort of a shot across the bow. But this looks like something that could really escalate. And speaking of escalation, this leads to our sort of final topic, which is Greenland, which, you know, if you had told me about 2 years ago that we were going to be talking about how U.S. designs on annexing Greenland, I'd be like, what is going on here?
This is an episode of Black Mirror or something.
You know, there's a lot of talk about Greenland in the beginning of the Trump administration, actually before the Trump administration even came to office. It sort of has died down over the last 6 months, but the operation in Venezuela to remove Maduro, which at least from a military standpoint has been tactically successful. You know, the fear here on the European side has been the appetite grows in the eating. And here the United States declaring the Monroe Doctrine that we can do whatever we want to protect American security, whatever that means. That could be extended to Greenland. And then those fears were like amped up by Stephen Miller's wife, who tweeted a picture of the map of Greenland with the US flag on it. Stephen Miller then goes on CNN on top evening shows and basically, you know, says that we're going to begin negotiations with Greenland. Over the break, Trump had appointed the governor of Louisiana to be the special envoy for Greenland to sort of oversee the negotiations. And so there's a huge uptick in the U.S. being like, yeah, Greenland is next. Like we are saying Greenland is next. Now, I think there's been some clarity that this isn't about necessarily a military operation, but we're going to try to strike some deal for Greenland, as our producer Otto has told us, you know, on his break in Copenhagen. And this is leading all the press in Denmark. Mette Frederiksen has been very outspoken, the prime minister of Denmark. She has now suddenly done very forceful statements, as have EU officials backing up Mette Frederiksen, saying Greenland is European. But this is going to be, I think, a real test of transatlantic relations going into 2026.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it sounds so absurd and it feels like one of those items on which the administration just throws stuff out and sees what happens. I think it's important to say there doesn't seem to be a lot of support even from some Republican lawmakers on this, but it keeps coming up. So it's one of those things where, you know, including in the first Trump administration, we will always talk about taking him not literally, but seriously, or not seriously, but literally. That's one of those things that's going to be developing. But I think across all of these dynamics, including the tech clashes that we were just discussing, this just feels like the first wave of what's been announced in the national security strategy of U.S. interference wherever it suits it and to pursue specific goals that it has identified, from, you know, democracy or whatever ideological support to some parts of Europe, all the way to protecting the homeland, and a very expansive definition of what it means to protect the homeland. We saw this obviously with the Venezuela operation, which is also not something that is playing very well in Europe. So the Greenland part is just one of those things. For me, it's like kind of a Rorschach test. It depends who you ask. Some people take it very seriously and are very panicked about it. And other people are just saying this is one of those things they're throwing out.
I think Europe should be very panicked about this because, and I think anyone that is focused on transatlantic relations should be very panicked about this, because this would not be very hard for the U.S. military to decide to just fly troops into Greenland. It already has a military base there and just run around, plant American flags, little green American men everywhere, and basically just, you know, have a showdown with Denmark and say, get your troops out or else they're going to be obliterated. Is that out of the question? I really don't think it is. And especially as the domestic popularity is going down. I'm not saying Venezuela was the wag the dog operation, but what happens is that it all works together. we want Greenland for emotional reasons. We want to control our hemisphere. It makes you look strong. You can make foreign policy reasons, political reasons. Oh, well, this will reverse our lack of popularity and reassert the administration. You can make all sorts of arguments that I could see coming together in the next few months, and who knows, where we end up doing something, frankly, that I would find fairly crazy. And let's be clear about the consequences, is that it means the end of NATO. It means that the transatlantic partnership is over. There is no way that if the United States basically attacks and seizes the territory of another NATO country, that the alliance can exist, that any sort of security guarantees, which are currently being talked about today in Paris, have any weight whatsoever. The alliance is over. And I don't think the administration really realizes that. I think they can have their cake and eat it too. They can seize Greenland. The Europeans are weak. Denmark will just bend the knee. Everyone will just crow a little bit and then just concede. And that Denmark will ultimately be forced to sort of sell or give it over. And this is where the people like Alexander Stubb that have been, playing golf with Trump and have been sucking up to Trump and the whole calling Trump your daddy strategy. Well, now you got to call him. And you got to call him and say, back off. And you got to lay down the law and say, if you do this, like the relationship that you have with Europe is over. Not only that, there are going to be huge economic consequences because we are going to have to go after your tech companies super hard. We're going to have to do whatever it may be, but you need to have a modicum of deterrence. Right now, the United States thinks we can just push Europe around and Europe will cave because, as Stephen Miller said at the CNN clip, that the United States is the power of NATO. So we can do what we want. We need it. So you're going to give it to us. That is the way it's viewed. And so you have to alter the calculation that, actually this will be extremely risky political action, right? Right now on paper, this looks fairly straightforward and easy for the United States to do. We can push Denmark. And if Denmark doesn't agree to it, we can just militarily take it. What's the big deal? Europe is not going to kick us out of NATO or whatever it's going to be because they need us. And I think that's how it's being perceived. And that calculation needs to be flipped. And the second thing I would say is that this is sort of separate, but there's been a lot of hype about the Arctic and the security threat of the Arctic, and the Arctic's really important. And it's true. Stuff is melting. There's more Chinese and Russian boats up there. The Arctic matters. It matters a lot more than it did, and it's going to matter more in the decades to come. But the hype has gone out of control here. It really has. The idea that we're facing some threat from, China and Russia up in Greenland. But basically there has been an uptick in activity, but it's gone from 0 to 2, right? It's not 0 to 100. And Russia is a real problem, but this administration doesn't view Russia as a real problem. Arctic shipping has increased by 37% in about a decade from 2013 to 2022. That's a lot, right? There's more commercial activity. It's going to matter. The shipping routes, it matters. But to say that we need to go and attack a NATO country because our security is under threat, and it's just utterly ludicrous. It's just totally absurd, especially when the Danes are what do you want? You can put more troops up here. You can do whatever you want to defend yourself. So this is a totally unnecessary act by this administration. And they're doing it not for really national security reasons. They're doing it for kind of emotive, bizarre reasons that need to be checked by Europe, and Europe can check them, but you have to get on the phone. You can't just put out a statement on Twitter or through your press office. It's got to be more forceful than that. And for people like Stubb, this is the cost of playing golf with the president. It's it's great when you feel very important and you can suck up, but now you actually have to stand up for the alliance, and we'll see if Rutte or Stubb or others will do it.
Yeah, and I think that's just another sign that this administration is ready to mix any and all areas, depending on what it is. It doesn't really matter. It can be both national security and economic reasons, and therefore will go after the tech regulation. That's what Brussels really needs to get on board with, because they're so used to compartmentalizing. We can agree on this while we disagree on that. We could before, but this administration is just ready to mix everything together and take action based on several reasons at the same time, or one that is disguised as another. And that's where Brussels needs to not be the frog that lets itself get boiled, is just not finding reasons to be, sanguine about it. It's but Breton is getting banned from the US, but he's no longer an official, so it's okay. No, it needs to be taken seriously, not panicked, but it needs to be taken seriously. There are instruments that Brussels can use for this, including the anti-coercion instrument. And since the US side is ready to do this, they need to be ready to do it as well.
The administration's been very clear, and maybe just to close, that they view this as a world order that is about power and it's about strength. And that's what they respect. And that's what they're trying to do with asserting the Monroe Doctrine. America's powerful. We can take what we want. And Europe has been very weak in response to that. There's been a deliberate strategy to suck up, to bend the knee, to call Trump daddy. We did a whole episode with Jeremy Shapiro about this, about how there are limits to that strategy. And I think Europe has hit the limits, where the problem with that is that we're the bully that will keep stealing your milk money. And the solution here is that Europe has to stand up for itself. It's got to punch the bully back. And I think that will reset the relationship, but it's got to do it. It did it a little bit on Twitter. That led to a response. You know, when you get in a fight, it's not the first punch or the second. You got to be ready to escalate continuously, escalate to de-escalate in a sense. And so I think where we are at heading into this year is a situation where the transatlantic relationship has never been more tenuous. It is on thin ice. And I think the only way to salvage it is for Europe to assert itself in its interests and to try to make it more of a partnership. Because if not, then it's just going to collapse under the weight of the actions of the Trump administration. It will just sort of careen out of control. And that's where we're headed on Greenland, unless Europe actually takes, I think, a stronger response. Also on tech policy and other things. If it keeps doing this itty bitty, tech regulation stuff, we're just going to have this fight drawn out for a very long time, and it will could escalate in a very, weird way, as opposed to let's have the confrontation sort of up front.
And what you said about salvaging it, I think is critical here. We're not saying Europe should respond just for the sake of escalation and conflict. It's just critical for the future of the transatlantic relationship for those two sides to be just honest with each other and be able to respond with the tools that they have so that down the line, they can approach the relationship from a more equal footing. Otherwise, as you were saying, it just peters out and then there's no future for the relationship.
Well, we look forward to 2026. Fortunately, for a podcast that focuses on Europe, there's going to be a lot to talk about. And so we encourage you to tune in, to subscribe, to recommend the podcast to your friends. And we look forward to more of these discussions on the Eurofile. That's it for today's episode. As always, if you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. You may also be interested in our sister podcast, Russian Roulette, which covers the latest on Vladimir Putin's Russia and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our thanks to our producers Shannon Young, Otto Svensson, and Lexi Linnefelter for coordinating and researching this episode. We'll be back soon with another assessment of Europe through a Washington lens. Until next time.